One of the reasons why it took so long to crush the 1798 rebellion was because the British army was in disarray. The commander-in-chief in Ireland, just before the outbreak of the rebellion, was a man called Ralph Abercrombie. But Abercrombie himself was disgusted with the treatment of prisoners in Ireland by the British troops. He was particularly horrified by a case where some people in a town witnessed the murder of an innocent man by some British soldiers. And when they tried to give testimony, one woman went forward to give testimony to that, and that woman was raped by the soldiers. And he issued general orders where he said that he was so disgusted, he said, "The army in Ireland is in a state of licentiousness. It is formidable to nobody except the enemy." And as a result, he was fired, and General Gerard Lake was put in charge, and he ended up carrying out, extending a policy of terror that he'd had in Ulster all the way through the rest of the country. And the strategy was kind of the same strategy they had when they were fighting the French in the war against France. They said, we should treat this as like the La Vendée. We should pretty much destroy these areas and destroy these territories. But the British government realised they needed to put their best general in charge. And the man they actually put in charge was the person they saw as their imperial troubleshooter, the person who they'd sent over during the American War of Independence, and he had eventually been defeated by George Washington at Yorktown, Charles Cornwallis. But despite the failure in America, he was still seen as their best man. In the late 1780s, when there was trouble in India, he was sent over as Governor General there to deal with the problems there. And so in 1798, in June 1798, they decided to send over Cornwallis as both Commander-in-Chief of the forces, but also as Lord Lieutenant, the person who had political and military control. And he brought both a military expertise to the position, but also a sympathy for the Catholics. And he was determined to put an end to all of these atrocities that were taking place in the country. Now, we mentioned how there was an outbreak of the rebellion in Wexford. There were some skirmishes in Kildare and other parts, and they were put down soon enough. Dublin remained quiet, but there were also daily floggings in Dublin. That one of the stories afterwards was that from Dublin Castle, you could hear the screams of the people being tortured. When they would capture rebels, they would chop off their heads, and they would stick their heads up on pikes at Dublin Castle as, again, a way of terrifying the people into submission. One of the people who played a major role in that was a lieutenant called Edward Heppenstall. And what he would do is he would tie up a captured prisoner from the neck and carry him around his back, choking him. And he would walk around St. Stephen's Green in Dublin, carrying a prisoner in that way. And sometimes he would start jogging to speed up the torture of the prisoner. And crowds would gather to laugh and applaud this. So that gives a sense of just how violent a time this was, and also just how horrific a time was it for people. So the big rebellion in the southeast of the country was in Wexford. And the rebels had an initial victory at Ullars Hill on the 27th of May, Ullars Hill, where our provost here in Trinity is from. And even though the rebels were successful there, they weren't quite as strategic as they should have been. Because I think the problem there is that the rebels were fighting with pikes, and they had no real military training. They were just farmers, they were just peasants. The British soldiers had been extensively trained, and they had cannons and they had muskets. And ultimately that was to prove decisive, because the Irish were brave, they were strong, they were courageous. They were great once they got close enough to the British soldiers to use their pikes. But if they were at a distance, well, then the pikes were no use whatsoever. So on the 28th of May, the rebels captured Enniscorthy, and they piked anyone who they thought was an Orange man. The yeomanry abandoned Gorey, and there, you see, they also committed an atrocity. They piked any prisoners they had before they were fleeing. And the rebels followed up by capturing Wexford town. And Wexford, the capture of Wexford, was really the high point of the rebellion in the south of Ireland. And there is a debate amongst historians about what happened in Wexford then afterwards. Some on the nationalist side would say that a Wexford Republic was inaugurated, that there was an attempt to create an independent entity known as the Wexford Republic. Others criticise that and say, well, we have no real evidence that they ever used the term republic. But certainly it does seem clear that they were aware that something was being created out of this. And whether they actually used the term republic or not, there was the creation of something different, and that this maybe was the meaningful expression of Irish pride and Irish independence. And they brought together various committees of Catholics and Protestants to try and administer things. The mistake that the rebels made then is that they did not seize New Ross, because that was a town that would have allowed them to carry the rebellion out, open up to further in the south. Instead, they decided to keep on in the Wexford area. And that was a major mistake, because when they eventually did go for New Ross, they were repulsed by the rifles and the cannon. And the failure to capture New Ross was a major blow. And in fact, that is what led then to the Scullabogue atrocity, where men, women and children were burnt to death in that barn. The big battle in Wexford took place at Vinegar Hill on the 21st of June. And that was where the British really came to terms with the advantages that they had tactically. General Lake was the person in charge of the British Army, and he decided that this was where we will make our cannon count. So the rebels foolishly believed that Vinegar Hill, this hill in Wexford County, was an area that should be defended. Now, really, it shouldn't have been, and a proper general with military experience would have realised that. But they decided, we'll keep this hill, force the British to go up the hill, and then we can use our pikes and kill them. But instead, the British just lined up their cannon and just shelled the rebels out of it. And what's incredible is that in the accounts of the British soldiers, we have expressions of respect for the rebels. They were amazed that these rebels, carrying just pikes, even though they had no formal military training, maintained their positions under such intensive firing, that they did not just turn and run away, that they fought bravely and heroically. But ultimately then, when the shock troops of the British went in, the rebels were no match for them. And Vinegar Hill was a decisive, crushing defeat for the Irish rebels. The Wexford Bridge atrocity followed then afterwards, and the British just had accumulated a huge army. Lake had 20,000 men for that battle, and it was a 2-hour battle, and even though the rebels had dug in, they were no match for the cannon or artillery of the British. And that defeat pretty much marked the end of the so-called Wexford Rebellion. That defeat pretty much marked the end of the rebellion in the south of the country. Now, I mentioned that there was also a rebellion in Ulster, heavy fighting in Antrim. A key battle was at Balnahinch on the 12th and 13th of June, and there the rebel General Munro was defeated by General Dundas, and several hundred rebels were killed. And effectively then, Ulster was sealed off from the rebellion, and the rebellion was put down there. The big outbreak then was Galway. The next stage of the rebellion was Galway. And here, the momentum came not from Ireland, but from France, because the French decided to send aid to these rebels. But unlike in 1796, when they had sent 14,500 troops to land at Bantry Bay, now they only sent 1,100 troops. So it was a small force under General Humbert, or General Humbert. So they weren't devoting as much resources as they had in 1796. And I think that was an indication that they knew this rebellion was not going to succeed. So Humbert landed in Mayo. They won some initial victories at Castlebar, what became known as the Races of Castlebar, because the British troops just turned away and ran. But that was really the only great victory of the rebels in the west of Ireland, because again, Cornwallis had now landed. He had taken over from Lake as commander-in-chief, and he set out with his 20,000 strong army to deal with this force of 1,000 French troops and, well, we don't know the exact numbers of Irish rebels, but probably more than 20,000, but troops that were not well armed, that they mainly had the pike. And what's interesting is that when we look at the French were not really impressed with the Irish. They were expecting to find a well-trained, well-armed group of United Irishmen, and instead they found peasants with pikes. Also, they found that they were very devout. They were praying with their rosary beads. They were trying to give their rosary beads to the French officers. And the French were astonished. They were saying, do they not realise we've got rid of Catholicism and the Catholic Church from our revolutionary France? Do they not realise we're not kind of on the same page here? So there was a certain lack of respect that the French had for the Irish rebels. Humbert is alleged to have said that if he had his way, he would have kept a third of the Irish rebels and he would have taken out and shot the rest. So there was a disconnect there between the Irish troops and the French troops. And so when Cornwallis set out to meet them, and they met on the 8th of September at Balnamuck in County Leitrim, you had a divided rebel force. And the French behaved disgracefully. They fought really half-heartedly for about an hour, and then they surrendered. And the Irish rebels carried on and eventually were forced to flee. And the French surrendered, knowing that they would be treated as prisoners of war. They wouldn't be murdered like the Irish rebels were being murdered when they were captured. That they would be traded for British prisoners of war, and that they would head back to France. And actually, that's exactly what happened. And it is said that some of the French officers actually offered up their horses to the British to help track down the fleeing Irish rebels if that was necessary. So the French alliance with the Irish proved a failure in 1798. They weren't prepared. They weren't as committed as the Irish had hoped. They didn't respect the Irish involvement in the conflict. And so that rebellion was planned. So honourable terms were given to the French. They were brought back in carriages that had bars, metal bars on them, because they were technically prisoners, but they were greeted by sightseers along the roads. They were saluted, they were cheered. The Irish rebels were hunted down by the British and killed as dogs. And that marked the end of the rebellion in Mayo. Some Irish deserted and joined the British side. The brother of one of the bishops, Bellew, had been put in charge of the unit of basically the Mayo area, but he wasn't a good choice either, and that wasn't very successful. So really what happened there is that the governments were successful in their containment of the country. They were able to seal off the southeast of the country. Then they were able to seal off Ulster. And with the defeat of the rebels at Balnamuck on the 8th of September, they were able to seal off the west of the country. And Cornwallis, though, spent a lot of his time not just dealing with the military campaign. He also began dealing with the political elements of it, because huge numbers of Irish rebels had been captured and they were put on trial in these military court-martials. But he began reviewing the evidence, and it was said that he spent 4 hours every evening reviewing the evidence. And sometimes he would pardon some of these because he would feel that the evidence wasn't satisfactory. He would feel that this person probably was innocent, and he commuted a lot of the sentences. And that was very important in helping to remove some of the toxic nature from the rebellion. That was very successful in removing some of the bitterness. The irony is that Cornwallis was criticised by the Protestant loyalists afterwards for being too lenient. Some of the loyalists said that if we have to keep on punishing these rebels until the year 2000 AD, we will keep doing so until we get satisfaction. And that was just too horrific for Cornwallis and the British government. And so he would not make what they said a Botany Bay out of Ireland. He was determined then to crush the rebellion, but to crush it as leniently as possible. And the idea then is that as soon as the rebellion was crushed, you would be able to reconcile Catholics and Protestants, you'd be able to reconcile the Irish with the British, and you would therefore restore Ireland to being a part of the British Empire that would remain loyal in the struggle against France and against external threats. But there was one thing that Cornwallis had not planned for, and that was the role that Wolfe Tone would still have to play. Because Wolfe Tone back in Paris was following what was going on. He was reading about all of the atrocities on the rebel side at Scullabogue, at Wexford Bridge, and they were horrifying him. But he realised that he should set out, he should visit Ireland, and he should help lead one last attack to help keep this rebellion going. I think in truth, he knew it wasn't going to succeed. I think in truth, he knew that it was a suicide mission. And I think the evidence for that is that it's the one time in his life he did not write any diaries, because he knew he was going to be captured or killed in action. But so, regardless of the risks, he set out with a small French force in September 1798. He made his way for Ireland to kickstart the rebellion again, and the voyage of Wolfe Tone and Wolfe Tone's role ended up being the last part of the 1798 rebellion.